The life of Franz Kafka does not begin with ideas or books. It begins quietly in a specific place, under a certain kind of roof, inside a home where silence and tension live side by side. To understand Kafka, it is important to move slowly into that space, because much of what later appeared in his writing was already present in the air he breathed as a child. Kafka was born in 1883 in Prague, a city that at the time belonged to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Prague was not just a beautiful city of stone bridges and narrow streets. It was a city divided by language, class, and identity. German speakers, Czech speakers, Jewish families, Catholic traditions, modern industry, and old medieval structures all existed together, often without truly understanding one another. Kafka was born into this complexity, and it shaped him long before he was able to name it. His family belonged to the Jewish middle class, but they were not deeply religious. They lived according to social expectations more than spiritual traditions. Kafka grew up speaking German in a city where most people spoke Czech. This alone created a sense of distance. From the beginning, he existed slightly apart from the world around him, never fully inside any one group. This feeling of not quite belonging would follow him throughout his life. The most powerful presence in Kafka's early world was his father, Hermann Kafka. Hermann was a large man, physically strong, loud, confident, and deeply convinced of his own authority. He had risen from poverty through hard work and ambition. He owned a successful business and believed strongly in discipline, practicality, and obedience. To him, life was something to be mastered through strength and effort. Kafka was the opposite. He was thin, sensitive, observant, and inwardly focused. Where his father valued certainty, Kafka lived with questions. Where his father spoke loudly, Kafka listened. This difference was not neutral. It created a constant pressure inside Kafka, a feeling of being judged, measured, and found lacking. As a child, Kafka learned early that approval was difficult to earn and easy to lose. His father did not intend to be cruel in a dramatic sense, but his constant criticism and emotional distance left deep marks. Kafka later described feeling small in his father's presence, not only physically but emotionally. This feeling of smallness became central to how Kafka understood authority, power, and guilt. Inside the family home, love was present but conditional. Expectations were clear but difficult to meet. Kafka grew up trying to become what was expected of him while quietly knowing that he never fully could. This tension created a divided inner life. Outwardly, he was obedient and polite. Inwardly, he was full of doubt, fear, and imagination. Prague itself reinforced this inner division. The city was modernizing rapidly. Factories, offices, and bureaucracy were expanding. Rules, paperwork, and systems governed daily life more and more. At the same time, ancient buildings and traditions remained. Kafka grew up watching the old world and the new world press against each other, neither fully winning. This sense of living inside an unfinished system later became one of the quiet foundations of his writing. At school, Kafka was intelligent and disciplined, but not joyful. He performed well, yet felt disconnected from the purpose of his education. Learning felt less like discovery and more like obligation. Success brought relief rather than pride. Failure brought shame rather than motivation. These patterns settled deep within him. Even as a young man, Kafka felt an almost constant sense of anxiety. Not panic, but a low continuous unease. A feeling that something was always slightly wrong, even when nothing obvious was happening. He was highly aware of his own thoughts, his body, his reactions. This self-awareness was intense and exhausting. It made him observant, but it also made rest difficult. Kafka began writing early, not because he wanted to become famous, but because writing offered him a private space where he could exist without judgment. On the page, he could express confusion without being corrected. He could describe fear without being told to be strong. Writing became a place where his inner life was allowed to exist fully, even if only in secret. At this stage of his life, Kafka did not yet see himself as a writer in any public sense. He was a young man shaped by family pressure, social expectations, and a deep internal sensitivity that had no clear outlet. He studied law, not out of passion, but because it was acceptable and practical. His life followed a path chosen more by necessity than desire. What is important to understand is that Kafka's sense of alienation did not come from dramatic events. It came from everyday life, from conversations that left him feeling misunderstood, from rooms where he felt watched, from rules that felt arbitrary yet unavoidable. These experiences slowly formed the mental landscape that would later appear in his stories. At the end of this early period, Kafka stands not as a philosopher or literary figure, but as a quiet observer of his own existence. A man learning to live inside structures that felt too large, too rigid, and strangely impersonal. He did not yet know what he would create from this tension. He only knew that something within him was constantly pressing to be understood. And so his story continues forward, shaped by work, illness, relationships, and the growing need to give form to the invisible weight he carried each day. As Kafka moved out of childhood and into early adulthood, the outer shape of his life began to settle into something that looked stable and respectable. He enrolled at university and studied law. This decision was not driven by passion or curiosity. It was a practical choice shaped by family expectation and social necessity. Law promised security, structure, and a clear role in society. For Kafka, it also promised something else. It promised a way to survive without having to explain himself. Prague at the turn of the century was becoming increasingly bureaucratic. Offices expanded, forms multiplied, institutions grew more complex and impersonal. Kafka entered this world quietly and competently. He completed his studies and eventually found work at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute. His job involved assessing industrial accidents, writing reports, and navigating regulations. On the surface, he was successful. He was reliable, precise, and respected by his colleagues. Inside, however, Kafka experienced his working life very differently. Each day required him to submit to schedules, procedures, and hierarchies that felt unnatural to him. He was deeply sensitive to how power operated in these systems. Decisions were made far away from the people they affected. Responsibility was everywhere, yet accountability felt distant. Rules existed, but their logic was often unclear. Kafka was not lazy or rebellious. He worked diligently, but the effort cost him greatly. After long days at the office, he returned home exhausted not only in body, but in spirit. Yet it was during these hours, late at night, that his real life began. While the city slept, Kafka wrote. Writing was not a hobby for him. It was a necessity. He often described it as something closer to breathing than to ambition. When he wrote, he felt momentarily aligned with himself. When he could not write, he felt unwell, restless, and disconnected. Still, writing did not bring him peace. It brought clarity, and clarity for Kafka was often painful. During this period, Kafka began to develop the themes that would later define his work. He wrote about individuals facing vast systems they could not understand, about guilt that had no clear cause, about authority that was everywhere yet nowhere. These were not abstract ideas. They were reflections of his daily experience. Kafka's relationship with his father remained a powerful force during these years. Though he was now an adult, the emotional dynamic had not changed. Kafka continued to feel judged and diminished in his father's presence. He felt unable to defend himself, unable to explain who he was or what he needed. This unresolved tension lived inside him, shaping how he understood authority figures of all kinds. At the same time, Kafka struggled deeply with intimacy. He desired connection, but feared it. Relationships felt overwhelming. The expectations of marriage and family seemed incompatible with his inner life. He worried that closeness would demand a version of himself he could not sustain. This conflict played out most clearly in his engagement to Felice Bauer. Kafka's letters to Felice reveal a man torn between longing and fear. He wanted companionship, yet he also feared that marriage would consume his time his energy, and his ability to write. Writing, for Kafka, was not something he did in addition to life. It was life. Anything that threatened it felt dangerous. His health began to suffer as well. Kafka was often ill, fatigued, and anxious about his body. He paid close attention to physical sensations, sometimes obsessively. Illness felt to him like both a threat and a message. His body seemed to resist the life he was living, even as his mind struggled to find an alternative. Despite these difficulties, Kafka continued to write with extraordinary discipline. He did not publish much during his lifetime, and he did not seek public recognition. What mattered to him was the act itself. Writing allowed him to give shape to feelings that otherwise remained formless and oppressive. One of the most important works from this period was The Judgment. Kafka wrote it in a single night, in a state of intense focus. He later described the experience as overwhelming and almost frightening. This story marked a turning point. For the first time, he felt that his writing had fully expressed something true about his inner world. Yet even this moment of clarity did not resolve his conflict. Kafka remained divided between the demands of ordinary life and the demands of his inner necessity. Each day required compromise. Each night offered brief alignment, followed by exhaustion. By the end of this phase of his life, Kafka had established the pattern that would define him. A man outwardly functional and inwardly strained. A professional by day and a writer by night. A participant in modern systems and a quiet critic of their invisible weight. His work life, his relationships, his health, and his writing were no longer separate. They had begun to merge into a single tension that would shape everything he created next. As Kafka moved further into his adult life, the tension he lived with began to deepen rather than resolve. The balance he had tried to maintain between work, writing, and personal obligation became increasingly fragile. What once felt difficult now began to feel unsustainable. Yet outwardly, very little appeared to change. This quiet contrast between inner strain and outer normality would become one of the defining conditions of his life. Kafka continued working at the Insurance Institute, and in many ways he was good at his job. He was precise, thoughtful, and conscientious. He even contributed to improving workplace safety standards, an irony not lost on him given how unsafe he often felt within himself. The office demanded clarity, efficiency, and obedience to procedure. Kafka provided these things, but at great personal cost. Each working day consumed energy that he believed belonged to writing. Writing, meanwhile, grew more demanding. It was no longer simply a refuge. It became a force that asked more of him the more seriously he took it. Kafka felt that to write truthfully required total commitment. Partial effort felt dishonest. This belief intensified his fear that ordinary life would eventually silence the only activity that gave his existence meaning. During this period, Kafka produced some of his most important work. Stories like The Metamorphosis emerged not as literary experiments, but as expressions of lived experience. The idea of a man waking to find himself transformed into something unacceptable did not feel symbolic to Kafka. It felt accurate. He understood what it meant to feel suddenly unfit for the roles one was expected to perform. He understood the shame of becoming a burden. He understood the quiet cruelty of being tolerated rather than understood. What makes Kafka writing distinctive is not the strangeness of its events, but the calm with which those events are accepted. His characters rarely protest loudly. They attempt to adjust. They feel guilty. They search for reasons within themselves. This emotional pattern reflects Kafka's own disposition. He rarely blamed others openly. He assumed fault, even when fault was unclear. His relationship with Felice Bauer continued to oscillate between closeness and withdrawal. Kafka proposed marriage more than once, then retreated. He wrote long letters explaining his fears, his limitations, his sense of inadequacy. These letters were not manipulative. They were confessions. He feared that marriage would require him to become someone stable, present, and socially functional in a way that felt impossible. Underlying these fears was Kafka's growing sense that his life was governed by invisible rules. Expectations existed, but their origin was unclear. Obligation felt absolute, yet justification was vague. This perception would later become central to works like The Trial, where a man is accused without being told of his crime and must navigate a system that offers no clear answers. Kafka's own health continued to decline. In 1917, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. The illness changed the practical conditions of his life, but it also confirmed something he had long suspected. His body could not sustain the life he was living. Illness forced him to slow down, to withdraw, and to confront his limitations more directly. Paradoxically, this period of physical weakness brought moments of psychological clarity. Removed from daily office routines, Kafka had more space to write and reflect. Yet even here, peace did not arrive easily. He felt guilt for not working. He felt fear about dependency. He felt anxiety about time slipping away. Kafka, writing during this period, became increasingly focused on systems, judgment, and unreachable authority. These were not abstract philosophical interests. They were the natural language of his experience. He lived inside systems that felt omnipresent and indifferent. He felt judged by standards he could not fully grasp. His writing gave these feelings form without offering resolution. What is important to understand is that Kafka did not see himself as a rebel or a critic of society. He saw himself as someone trying and failing to comply. His suffering came not from rejection of the world, but from his desperate desire to fit within it without losing himself. As this phase of his life progressed, Kafka stood at a difficult crossroads. His writing had matured, his insight had deepened, yet his physical strength weakened, and his capacity to compromise diminished. The world asked for clarity, stability, and productivity. Kafka could offer insight, sensitivity, and honesty. The distance between these demands continued to grow, quietly but relentlessly, shaping the final direction of his life and work. As Kafka's health declined, his life narrowed in visible ways while expanding inwardly. Tuberculosis forced him to leave the steady routines that had structured his days. He spent long periods in sanatoriums and rural settings, away from the city, away from the office, and away from the constant pressure to perform. These environments were quieter, slower, and more isolated. For Kafka, this isolation was both a relief and a confrontation. Freed from daily bureaucratic work, Kafka found more time to write, but he also found fewer distractions from his own thoughts. Without the rhythm of ordinary obligations, his inner life became more intense. Writing continued to feel essential, yet it was accompanied by doubt. He questioned whether his work was complete, whether it was honest enough, whether it justified the sacrifices it demanded. During this period, Kafka began work on his longer and more complex narratives. The Trial and The Castle emerged not as finished statements, but as ongoing struggles. These works remain incomplete, and this incompleteness is not accidental. Kafka found it increasingly difficult to bring his stories to closure. Resolution felt dishonest to him. His experience of life offered no clean endings, no final explanations. The worlds Kafka created during this time are governed by rules that are never fully revealed. Authority exists everywhere, yet its source remains distant and inaccessible. Characters search for clarity and recognition, but their efforts lead only to deeper confusion. These stories reflect Kafka's own sense that life operated according to systems that could be navigated but never understood. Kafka's relationships during this phase were marked by gentleness and distance. He formed a close bond with Dora Diamond, who offered companionship without demanding transformation. With her, Kafka experienced moments of ease that had been rare in his life. Yet even this relationship existed under the shadow of illness and impermanence. Kafka was acutely aware that time was limited. His relationship with his family, particularly his father, remained unresolved. Kafka wrote a long letter to his father that he never delivered. In it, he attempted to explain the fear and confusion that had shaped his life. The letter was not an accusation. It was an attempt at understanding. It revealed how deeply Kafka still sought recognition and peace within that relationship, even as he accepted that it might never come. As his illness progressed, Kafka became increasingly preoccupied with clarity and honesty. He revised obsessively. He destroyed many of his own writings, believing them unworthy or incomplete. He asked his close friend Max Brod to destroy his unpublished work after his death. This request reflected not self-hatred, but an uncompromising standard. Kafka believed that work released into the world carried responsibility, and he was unwilling to offer anything he felt was unfinished or false. Despite his withdrawal from public life, Kafka's awareness of the world remained sharp. He followed political and social developments closely. He lived through a period of immense change, including the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These shifts reinforced his sense that authority was fragile and systems were temporary, even when they appeared absolute. In these later years, Kafka's writing grew quieter but no less intense. He focused less on external events and more on inner states. Themes of silence, waiting, and endurance became more prominent. His work no longer sought to explain the world. It sought to inhabit it truthfully. Kafka's final period was marked by a growing acceptance of limitation. He did not find peace in the conventional sense, but he found a form of clarity. He understood that his life would not resolve its contradictions. Writing remained his way of staying honest within that reality. As his strength faded, Kafka continued to write as long as he could. Each sentence carried weight. Each effort felt costly. Yet he persisted, not out of hope for recognition, but out of fidelity to his own inner necessity. The shape of his life was becoming complete, even as his work remained open. In the final years of Franz Kafka's life, the boundaries between writing, illness, and existence almost completely dissolved. Tuberculosis gradually took his ability to speak, eat, and move without pain. His world became smaller, quieter, and slower. Yet even as his physical strength diminished, the clarity of his inner life remained. Kafka spent his last months in care facilities, often in silence. Communication became difficult. Simple acts required effort. The body, which had always felt like a fragile companion, now asserted its limits fully. For Kafka, this was not only physical suffering, but a confrontation with dependency and vulnerability, conditions he had long feared. Despite this, Kafka's final period was not marked by despair in the way one might expect. He did not rage against his fate. He observed it. He accepted help. He remained attentive to small details. The texture of time, the presence of others, the quiet of the room. These details mattered to him, perhaps more than they ever had before. Kafka died in 1924 at the age of 40. He left behind a body of work that was largely unpublished and unfinished. He did not consider himself successful. He did not imagine that his writing would one day be widely read. His concern had never been fame. It had been honesty. After his death, Kafka's friend Max Brod made a decision that would shape literary history. He chose not to destroy Kafka's unpublished manuscripts, despite Kafka's request. Instead, he edited and published them. Through this act, works like The Trial, The Castle, and America entered the world. These texts were unlike anything readers had encountered before. They did not offer moral lessons or clear interpretations. They described experiences that felt strangely familiar, yet difficult to explain. Readers recognized in Kafka writing the feeling of facing systems that could not be reasoned with, of living under judgment without understanding the charge, of seeking meaning in structures that offered none. Over time, Kafka's name became associated with a particular kind of experience. The word Kafkaesque entered language, describing situations that are absurd, oppressive, and inescapable. Yet this label risks oversimplifying Kafka's work. His writing is not about absurdity alone. It is about sincerity in the face of confusion. It is about endurance rather than rebellion. Kafka's philosophy was never formalized. He did not write treatises or manifestos. His thought lived inside stories, characters, and situations. He explored what it meant to live with guilt without knowing its source, to obey rules without understanding their purpose, to seek belonging in a world that offers only partial recognition. What makes Kafka enduring is not his strangeness, but his restraint. He did not exaggerate suffering. He did not offer solutions. He described experience as it felt. This honesty allows readers from different times and cultures to find themselves in his work. Kafka's life was quiet, constrained, and often painful. Yet from this narrow space, he produced insight of lasting depth. He showed that one does not need dramatic events to confront profound questions. Ordinary life, when observed closely, contains enough mystery, fear, and meaning to occupy a lifetime. Today, Kafka is read not because he explains the modern world, but because he articulates the inner condition of those living within it. His work continues to speak to those who feel overwhelmed by systems, uncertain of their place, and burdened by expectations they did not choose. Kafka did not resolve the contradictions of his life. He lived inside them, and in doing so, he gave them a form that continues to resonate, quietly and persistently, long after his own voice fell silent.